Back in the 80s, we put on parties in the desert, and we called ourselves Desolation Center.
Is the punk movement part of the Nazi movement?
No, it's the police. That's the Nazi movement.
The early 80s was a time of experimentation and rebellion.
The LAPD freaked out about punk rock like it was the second coming of the Black Panthers.
I started thinking I need to apply some of the out-of-the-box punk rock thinking. Why couldn't we put this kind of really cool music into this desert environment? How many things could go wrong, you know?
I immediately understood the element of danger and the element of feeling alive are actually connected.
Everything that I found exciting at the time, all here in this remote spot.
Total anarchy.
That desert environment is awesome for acts of freedom.
Desolation Center was one of the inspirations when we started doing Burning Man.
It was beyond the theory, you know, it was made real. This gig makes total sense.
And I just remember thinking, this is transformative. Those shows reflected that spirit of, I'm gonna make it happen.
It was definitely one of those doors that opens and you're kind of different on the other side.
I was kind of hoping to see the hillside come down on everybody, but that's my disappointment.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Scott Crawford. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are going to be talking about a phenomenal documentary film called Desolation Center. I'm joined by some of the filmmakers as well as some esteemed other artists that will introduce themselves in a second. But I think it should be a really entertaining talk tonight. The film, if you're not familiar, chronicles this sort of legendary series of events that took place starting in downtown Los Angeles in the early 80s and then kind of migrated out to the desert. And bands like Sonic Youth, Minutemen, Meat Puppets, Swan, Savage Republic, Red Cross. I mean, a who's who of, of anyone that was, making original music and redefining what was going on at the time. And it's really become this sort of template in a way. The series of events became sort of a template for Coachella and Lollapalooza and Burning Man, and you'll see that when you see the film. But enough of me. Let's introduce the panel here. If maybe you guys could all just introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Stuart, and thanks Scott and then Steve and Bob and Mariska for doing this with us. I directed the film, and I'm also one of the people that organized these events back in the day. So, it's been really cool to be able to share all this and have everyone, participating.
Mariska, I'm the co-producer. I was also on the buses, and Sonic Youth changed my life a little. By the way.
My name is Bob Bert. I was an early drummer of Sonic Youth, and I was the one who played at the Desolation Center show out in the desert. And 35 years later, I don't think I've played a show that's even come close to that experience.
Wow.
I'm Steve Shelley, and I'm also a drummer of Sonic Youth. And I've been working with Stuart on a soundtrack album of from his movie Desolation Center.
Great.
Really? Tell us about the soundtrack album. What's that?
That too, but because the soundtrack is phenomenal. And I was going to ask you about that. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's kind of, I guess, start from the beginning, and this is really to the whole panel. But this is a film that takes place in LA in the early 80s, 82, 83 through about 85, if I remember correctly. And I'm just trying to get a sense for folks that weren't there of the kind of landscape, cultural landscape of not just LA. I think Stuart and Mariska, you can speak to that, but also, the country. So maybe we could start with, kind of the West Coast, and then go to Bob, and then Steve was in a pretty infamous Midwestern hardcore band called the Crucifix, and he can speak to maybe the Midwest and just kind of give us a sense of how all this stuff was able to come together in this perfect kind of storm.
So, I mean, I guess I can start off, and from our perspective, I think I first discovered punk rock on Rodney on the Rock, which was a legendary radio show here that it always felt like the cool stuff was going on somewhere else, in LA back then. And so over time, we started to, have the Germs and X and all these great bands. And so that was like the first wave. And then I feel like the Minutemen and people like that, Black Flag being kind of like their mentors in terms of the whole indie music thing, just got us all, moving forward in terms of like how music could change and not just be this static thing. And so for me, it was like, I loved the whole live music thing, but then we had the Cops that were really, kind of head to head against particularly Black Flag. So anyway, I wanted to kind of capture some of that in the film, that it wasn't just suburban white kids, it was Latinos, blacks, gays, straight, and I think that was something we took for granted because we were all kind of like misfits and, in our high schools or whatever. But, punk rock was the thing that kind of brought everybody together. So that was the beginning. And then the whole desert thing sort of evolved out of a certain amount of necessity and a certain amount of just trying to like question all the assumptions, because it was independent music, independent labels, all that stuff.
Mariska, what was your experience you were in LA at the time, correct?
Yeah, I grew up in LA. I actually lived in Highland Park, which is a little different now. It's a bit of hipsterville. But I actually met Stuart in front of the Anti Club, because back then everybody was in bands and we made fanzines, and I think I sold him fanzine for $0.25.
You got to tell them the name of the fanzine. It's very topical.
Oh, it is. Contagion. So there you go.
Might want to bring it back. Or not.
It was a great little community. It's, everyone knew each other, and goes music every night of the week.
Bob, you were in New York at that time?
Yeah, I grew up right outside of New York. So, and I was, when I was like 29, I guess, when I played at Desolation Center. So I grew up, when I was in high school, it was like the early 70s. And that's just like, when Ziggy Stardust came out and Lou Reed's Transformer and Roxy Music, and we were discovering all this stuff. And I started going to rock concerts when I was like 14, and started going to clubs right around then, because I went to see the New York Dolls at Max's Kansas City in 1973, and started following Wayne County and the Backstreet Boys around. And then in 1975, my friends like, let's go check out this CBGB place. So I wandered in there. It was a double bill of Patti Smith and Television, and there weren't that many people there, but I found this world that I discovered. And then, New York went through lots of phases. Like after that, it kind of evolved into the no wave scene. And at this point in time, I had no interest at all in even being a musician. I took drum lessons, when I was 12. And then I moved to Hoboken in New Jersey, right across the river, in 1981. And that's when I accidentally fell into a band and started playing. And then a few months, 7 months later, I was in Sonic Youth. And that was like 1982. And so as far as the scene in New York goes, it kind of went from the CBGB's Max's scene of all those amazing bands that were starting up. And then that kind of went by kind of quick, and all of a sudden there was a no wave scene with Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and Mars and the Contortions and all these bands. And then from there in the early 80s, it was, Sonic Youth, Swans, Live Skull, Rat-At, Rat-R, and that whole scene. And then, and after I left Sonic Youth, I joined this band Pussy Galore, and that was a whole other scene with like White Zombie, The Unsane, Cop Shoot Cop. And so, yeah, so that's my deal. And then, when in 1985, we went out with Sonic Youth, we went out to LA, and Kim grew up there, so Kim and Thurston ended up going out there and making a lot of connections already. And we hooked up with that guy who Iridescence Records. Michael Shepard, yeah. And so we went out there for at least a week and a half, I guess. We stayed at Kim's parents' house, and we played the Desert Show, which was phenomenal. We also played at Al's Bar with St. Vitus, and then we played at the Lingerie Club with Red Cross, I think. And then, we ventured up the West Coast and played an infamous show in Seattle with Green River and the U-Men that, didn't think much of at the time, but, now I'm hearing, Buzz from the Melvins was there and all these people were there. So it was a cool time.
And that's great. And Steve, what about you? And specifically, I think one of the things that the film mentions is and Stuart, you alluded to this already, is the amount of attention that the local authorities kind of paid to anyone, well, especially LA was notorious, correct me if I'm wrong, was notorious for this sort of relationship with anyone that was another, it's an age-old story. But judging by one of the songs that the Crucifix did, I'm guessing that you might have had some of the same problems in the Midwest, Steve, with the authorities.
Well, at least one of our members did. Yeah, we were located Lansing, Michigan, and I guess there was sort of a persecution going on by the local police, and we found it hard to find a place to play, and I think we made it hard on ourselves at the same time. We didn't make it easy to live and let live. But sure, I can relate to what was going on in LA to a small degree. I think what I've seen in the movie clip, that's pretty extreme. From it's a lot different from what we went through in Michigan.
Michigan was a smaller scene, I guess. Oh, did we lose Steve?
Yeah, the scene was smaller. Yeah.
All right.
Steve's breaking up over here.
Yeah. Should we pick up the ball?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, guys.
No worries. So I'm just trying to create a sense of this kind of. You had a target on your back then. In other words, if you look different, you had a target on your back. So when it came to the authorities, everyone's, this is not a new story. It's something that anyone that was listening to punk rock or going to punk rock shows in the 80s knows. But specifically, when you, Stuart, started working on the beginnings of what would become the shows in downtown LA, I don't think it took. I think one of the reasons that you chose downtown LA was because of the amount of focus and the sort of microscope that the punk rock scene was under in some of these other clubs. Am I correct?
Yeah, it seemed like back then, I think, not to the degree maybe of, the East Village when Bob was in that scene, but it was kind of a wasteland, certainly for LA standards. There wasn't a lot of cop oversight over anything, really. There was a lot of homeless, people, a lot of crack stuff on the street, and, they weren't really interested in doing anything about it. So that was good in the sense that we were able to, you know, kind of just use warehouse spaces and stuff. I didn't do a lot of those kind of shows because even so, eventually they would get shut down. You know, but we didn't have really any brutal situations in the shows that I promoted. But right. Definitely everybody that from our scene that was interviewed in the film, I mean, everybody was in situations where they would come out with you know, batons and riot gear and whack the shit out of, you know, young kids. I mean, you know, I think Linda Kite puts it the best, but there was definitely some famous episodes. And so after a while, you know, it just started to feel like we need to figure out another way to do this, or we're not going to be able to have a live scene, you know. And so that's kind of where we started looking at other options. Because by the time downtown was not working out, it was like, well, where else can we go? But, you know, in addition, it was also, I think, LA has this desert next to it, you know, and that's something you couldn't do in other places. So I think it was also kind of like trying to embrace what was special about our situation, you know.
And again, I guess that was part of the spirit of the time. You know, it was very DIY, and no one was going to find it for you, so you had to kind of make up your own spaces, and you kind of took it to a whole new level. But I think pretty brilliantly. You know, I never would have imagined, you know, to take something out into the 3 hours out into the desert. But I think there's some great footage in the film where there's some sort of famous photos that been floating around for years. I think it's Ed Culver, I think, took that famous shot of, I think it was Black Flag, the Ramones, and maybe Circle Jerks. I can't remember. But
it was the Minutemen opening. It was actually, just for the record, it was Gary Leonard. Ed Culver is brilliant, and he's taken a lot of iconic images. But because I had to get it from the LA Library, I happen to know.
Got it.
So I was there that night, and you know, I think a lot of people in the scene were, and yeah, it was really messed up. I mean, pretty much just provoked by the police, and because like it was a grudge match between them and Black Flag. They hadn't actually played in LA City in a year and a half or maybe more, and so they really wanted to make a point, and that was the situation.
Right. Well, let's Stephen, let's go to that scene in the film if we can, where we can kind of illustrate just the sense of chaos and bullying that went on with the LAPD.
The thing with the LAPD was you had this really rotten man called Chief Daryl Gates. He's like he was the Grand Wizard.
And you know who's feeding and supporting the enemy? The casual drug user.
He was creepy, and he was definitely racist, and he didn't like women, and he just didn't like anybody of color at all. He didn't like young people. He didn't like young people having fun. The police would show up in mass, and it was like you didn't know why, what was going on. We're at a punk show, like seeing the band, and then there's like a bunch of police coming in the door of the whiskey. Like, what's up with that?
Is the punk movement part of the Nazi movement?
No, it's the police. That's the Nazi movement.
The police is the Nazi movement?
Yeah.
Well, the effect of the news media was that the LAPD freaked out about punk rock like it was the second coming of the Black Panthers. And they were just like, they were going to squash that stuff. You know, it wasn't going to get a foothold in their town.
Well, sometimes they would come in and run everybody out of there, like with their sticks and stuff. And they just seemed like they were going through the newspaper and finding band names that sounded punk rock and trying to make sure they didn't happen for some reason.
Great. So as you saw in that clip, it was a pretty stressful time to be promoting shows of any kind, let alone playing them. So in LA at that point. So Stuart, that's kind of where we were just talking about, you know, it's essentially this, you know, it was kind of like what was going on. You could compare it to Detroit with the White Panthers, where you had, you know, the local FBI and everybody was just surveilling them and giving them a hard time. I think there was some of that going on, probably less surveillance, but more just harassment.
I think I like the way Don Bolles, I don't know if that was exactly in the clip, but he said, the LAPD said it's the second coming of the Black Panthers, which, is funny when you look at what happened later with NWA and Fuck the Police and 92 and riots and what's going on this year. But so we got a little taste of that, but it definitely, I think it was close enough to the late 60s radicalism that they were freaked out. They just saw these anarchist symbols and they're like, we must stop this, so.
So that was enough for you to kind of start to think outside the box. But let's back up a second before we get out to the Mojave Desert and talk a little bit about, because you did have a few shows. You had one on a boat with the Minutemen, correct?
Right. Well, what we did a couple, we did the downtown stuff. And then the first show that we did that was sort of outside of the regular environment was actually out in the desert, right near where Sonic Youth played, later in '85. So it was really just a small version of that idea. We had 3 school buses and we had a sound guy, who brought his generator out, and you can actually hear his voice in The Decline of Western Civilization at Sereno, because he also did a lot of those Cuckoo's Nest shows. And it was Savage Republic and the Minutemen, and so it was like double headliners, and about 100 and something people. And so then later on, I did a show on a boat in San Pedro, but that was actually the third kind of Desolation Center show that's featured in the film.
Got it. Okay. So and I think we should also take a second too to describe for folks, like Desolation Center was not a specific place. It was, it was your creation that you came up with. I even love the fact that you actually sort of had your own manifesto of sorts that you wrote for any.
Yeah, we kind of, that was even before we started going out to the desert, but I don't know. We felt like we needed to make this statement of principles, and a couple friends of mine and I were just sitting around drinking beers and wrote this whole manifesto up, and put it on the back of the flyer. But look back on it, and it really did. It's not like I went back and referenced it all the time, but it did sort of foreshadow the spirit of what we were doing. And I think back at that point in time, it was one of those moments in LA where the record industry had kind of discovered the Go-Go's, and there was MTV kind of in the works and stuff like that. So I think we were trying to kind of distance ourselves from the places where those people would go, which was like the Sunset Strip, and do something different, Not that, I love the Go-Go's when I first used to go see them, but I think by that time we felt like the scene needed to be a little bit off the radar,
Right. So without giving too much away, I'd love to just maybe you could quickly let folks know how, when I think about this now, it astounds me, but getting the word out about this show in the Mojave Desert with the Minutemen and Savage Republic, and then B, actually getting people from point A to point B, getting them from downtown LA on school buses, correct?
Yeah. So, Bruce Leisher was really important in it, and in the sense that he was the founder of Savage Republic, and I think I heard something in their music that was kind of Arabic or spaghetti Western vibe, even though it was really noisy and had similarities to what Sonic Youth was doing in terms of their atonalness, and so I came back from visiting a friend of mine's family in Mexico. And so we were driving through desert a lot, Arizona, and then across the border in Sonora. And we were listening to all this kind of music that was related, Public Image Limited, or, Wire, other things that I felt like had this quality of being a little bit more like, almost like otherworldly. It wasn't space rock like old school space rock. And so the desert kind of fit with that. So when I came back, I was like, I didn't really know Bruce at that time. But I said to him, hey, would you be interested in playing a show out in the middle of the desert? And he was like, yeah. And I also know a good dry lake bed that I could take you to. So that was the first part of it. And then I drove out there with him. So I wasn't like a big desert rat or anything. It was more just a concept. And then we just started trying to figure out how to do it. And the school buses was like, how do you charge tickets? How do you get people there? I didn't really trust the like local scenesters to actually get themselves out to the middle of the desert necessarily. And it also meant you could get messed up and you didn't have to drive. So there's a lot of different reasons, but also we didn't tell people where they were going. So there's a little bit more of a performance art aspect. And then Mariska, you must have been one of the first people that I hit up to actually help do this.
Weren't you in, wasn't it one of your responsibilities to sort of...
I was bus monitor, yeah.
Yeah, keep everybody, from acting too insane on the bus.
We had these weird waivers where people would have to sign in case they got hurt, but I don't know what happened to those.
Now, who was
valid or not?
That's what
she
I
was in a band with Perry Farrell at the time too, which is how I met Perry. And so Perry there's 3 buses. I think Mariska had one bus, and then Perry had one of the buses as taking the tickets. And so
that's great.
he was your supervisor. But anyway, so we all got there. Everybody survived.
Yeah.
But later on, Perry and a different lineup of SciComm opened for the Sonic Youth show.
Right. So that particular show didn't all go as planned. I know I think if I remember correctly that there was kind of a windstorm and there were some audio issues. So you went from that, and what did you learn from that? What did you take away from that leading up to this show with Sonic Youth, and what did you want to do differently?
I thought it was really cool. I guess I just somehow wanted it to be bigger. That was my idea, and I actually didn't know what that was going to mean. I didn't even know if I was going to do another desert show. I might have just jumped into doing something else, like the Joy at Sea show on the boat or whatever. But then I quit my job, and I ended up just basically bumming around Europe for a while, and I met the people from Einstürzen Neubauten. We haven't really talked about that much,
right?
But they were kind of like this thing where people are like, you got to see these guys. They bang on metal, and they're like industrial music, but with power tools. And so when I saw them, that kind of like, and I somehow, had a conversation with them at this club afterward or whatever. We started talking about playing out in the middle of the desert. So then that gave me a bit more of a like motivation that Einstürzen Neubauten was going to be the next one.
Right.
And then a lot of the other things that came about were somewhat related to them, knowing people like Survival Research Laboratories, Boyd Rice, things like that.
Right. And so is that the one? So you printed up tickets in advance?
We always had tickets. Actually, that was another, Bruce Leisher thing, is that he actually had this printing press where he did these beautiful flyers and album covers and stuff like that. And, we're still in touch with Bruce, and I think Steve and I are talking about working with him on the soundtrack when it comes out. So,
yeah, anytime they put out anything that he did back then was so identifiable. You instantly knew.
So we had pretty basic flyers, but really beautiful tickets.
Yeah, tickets are great.
How it worked out. But as far as we got a little bit more publicity, I think more than I even remembered when I started looking into it. Like there was blurbs in the LA Weekly and things like that. Right. And we ended up with 6 buses, so still limiting it. You had to be on the bus if you want to get there, kind of thing. And a few people obviously drove out. What am I going to say? No, Chuck Dukowski, you can't take your van.
Right.
But, that basically was a similar thing. I mean, what we had trouble with the first one was buses breaking down, people like throwing rocks at the bus from the side of the freeway because there was a bunch of loudmouth punk rockers yelling at local gangbangers. And so I tried to avoid all those scenarios. Mariska, did we do any better with getting people home the second time around?
God, I never remember anything past noon. So,
but I mean, no one really got hurt. So that was the important thing. And in the case of the second show, we actually had Mark Pauline bringing explosives and blowing up refrigerators. And so that was kind of an epic opening act for Einstürzen Neubauten.
Sort of the sounding like we've now begun, wasn't it? Like he did an explosion and then like the steel, wasn't he? There was an explosion that took place to let everyone know, okay, the concert is about to begin.
Yeah, you could put it that way. I mean, yeah, I think we had somebody, Ed talking into the microphone and saying like, get away from the rocks because things are going to start blowing up. And it wasn't quite the massive explosion that had been promised, but there was definitely some flying sheet metal and some things that I didn't even realize were going on until I went back and started interviewing people.
Right. Yeah, the one sounded pretty hairy when you had the flying piece of sheet metal that was just 10 feet above the audience's head. That could have been dicey, literally. So, one of the things I think about when I think about going to shows back in the 80s was that experience of not just getting to of not just experiencing the music and being at the show and then leaving and just the adrenaline pumping, but getting there. Getting there was part of the fun too. It was this entire night where you would have to figure out, okay, if I take bus 340 and then I can take it and pick it up in the corner of whatever, and you take that bus, or you hitchhike, or your friends get a ride, they give you a ride, whatever. But we're talking, this is next level. We're talking 3 hours. Okay, and so out of downtown LA. But what I'm curious about is, Bob, what was it like for you? I mean, there's no GPS. We have to give people a sense of the time. This is what, 85? 85, thank you. So no GPS. The maps were kind of handwritten, I'm sure you had actual topographical maps, but some of the maps in the film looked like they were handwritten. I mean, what were you guys thinking? How did you, A, did you ever get lost? B, were you thinking, what the hell? What were you?
Well, I remember you had to, if you bought a ticket, they gave you a map at the record store or wherever you bought the ticket. And I don't remember us having any problem going out there. If you see in the film, Red Cross got completely lost, and everyone was freaking out whether they were going to show up. And but I don't remember. I don't even remember who drove or what kind of vehicle we were in. But we just got there and everything was cool. I remember before the show, I went over to some guy's house to check out the drum set I was going to use, and it was like this weird goth guy that had lizards all over his place, and it wasn't until about 10 years later that I realized it was Perry.
Wow, that's great. So, now, did you guys headline that show? Sonic Youth headline?
Well, I don't know what you consider headlining.
I guess Red Cross got lost, so they probably
ended up playing last, and it was Psycom, then the Meat Puppets, then Sonic Youth, and then Red Cross. But it was our first time out there, so no one really knew that much about us. And then we were freaked out because we drove up and we hear everyone's tripping on acid, and I'm me especially, I'm like, people are taking acid in 1985. What's up with that? So it was kind of crazy, and I was really excited because Thurston had turned me on to Red Cross, and that was the first time I would get to see them, and they just blew me away, and I've been such a big fan of since. Steve was 16 at the time, Steve McDonald. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you look at pictures of him now, and he looks like he was 10.
Yeah, I know.
Bigger than he was. I think that's a good segue into the Sonic Youth performance video, Stephen. Can we see that? There's a great performance video from Desolation Center where you see them playing this show where there were 500 tabs of acid handed out to the audience, and so it was quite the evening.
And that was courtesy of the Meat Puppets.
That's right. So, Stephen, if
things were getting weirder, songs were getting longer, and bands were going off in very different directions. It was this sort of just new thing emerging.
I think when we started hearing about what was going on with these gigs in the desert with Neubaum and Survival Research Laboratories, and then Minutemen on the boat, it just sounded like it was part and parcel with all this.
Remember, it was really cold that night, right?
Weird action that
you
was
guys playing in the cold?
Yeah, it was. We had winter jackets on.
Winter coats.
It was all about like, yeah, you know, you're gonna love it out here. They have all these great burgers, and yeah, well, me and Kim went with the nip drivers up to Spawn Ranch, and like, they were taking some black gel acid, but not me and Kim.
And then they came back to visit Kim's family over Christmas, and so we decided, well, since they're gonna be here anyway, let's do a desert show. So we picked the first full moon after New Year's.
Great, so that was Sonic Youth playing out in the desert. What was the exact town? That was not the Mojave. That was, Stuart, what town was that in?
Well, it's all the Mojave. It's a place called Lucerne Valley would be the closest town. The dry lake bed is called Soggy Dry Lake. But if people know Joshua Tree, it's really not too far from there. Maybe a half-hour drive, something like that.
Right.
There was a full moon, I think, no?
Yeah, that was part of the plan, yes.
I think that's in the film, isn't it? Isn't there a shot of the full moon, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what were some of the other, do you remember anything else, Bob, from that evening that struck you other than Red Cross? What were the Meat Puppets?
The Meat Puppets, they were doing, I think they were playing most of the stuff from Up on the Sun album, is that's the name of it. And it was very kind of like, you know, I actually have, I had a DVD and a video of the whole show, except for SciComm. And the Meat Puppets were pretty mellow, kind of jammy, you know, perfect.
Yeah,
perfect scene. You know, they were really good. And yeah, I just remember that big pile of rocks. And it was weird because, you know, there's no stage, you're playing on the ground. And especially during Red Cross's set, you see all these, like, you know, drunk people. One guy pulls his dick out, I think. Is that in the film? I don't know. But it was crazy because everyone was like right there in your face. And I think basically, you know, people, you know, never heard anything quite like us before. So they were probably, I would imagine it gave them a pretty weird trip.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Steve, kind of moving forward, I'm jumping around a little bit, but so much of this is about context. You know, Sonic Youth played Lollapalooza in, what, 95, I think? Was that the first time you played Lollapalooza? Uh-oh. Okay, you can just...
lip reading.
Yeah, I'm trying to lip read.
I'm back. I think that's correct.
Yes. Okay. So, given what we know now about some of these shows that were taking place, that again were powered by generators, very DIY in every sense of the word. Give us a sense of like what playing Lollapalooza was, you know, 10 years later. You know, where there. I mean, we're talking about shows that Stuart put on. You know. There are no dressing rooms. There's no bathrooms. There's no bar. There's no, you know, so give us a sense of, you know, the differences 10 years later, you know, in the 90s.
Well, in the 90s, you know, it was a lot more corporate America, which was, you know, not as much fun. There was a lot of advertising and you had to work your way around that and you know, do your best to present what you wanted to present without the, you know, the corporate world getting in the way.
Right. Yeah. So, which is a great segue into the fact that, you know, we've mentioned Perry Farrell several times now. Perry was at both desert shows, Stuart?
All three. Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry. So, so that, you know, clearly inspired him, or was part of his inspiration for, you know, putting together Lollapalooza. But I think a little more, at least geographically speaking, you have, you know, Golden Voice doing Coachella years later, and then of course Burning Man as well. What is it about the desert that you think appeals to sort of not just the artists that are playing, but the audience as well? You know, is it just that it's so expansive? There's a sense of freedom. It's what? It's just interesting to me that some of the most successful festivals, well, up until this year, to, take place in the desert.
Didn't Chris say something in the movie, Chris Kurtwood, about how playing in the desert allowed you to really relate, or the audience to really relate to the...
It's going so well.
Yeah.
Did we lose you?
Steve.
I mean, Mariska, do you want to kind of, I mean, because you're still involved with events in the desert. You want to talk a little bit about what you've been doing it all these years?
Yeah, it's just a sort of alien-like. I think someone who was in the movie said Sonic Youth was alien-like because of the music, and it just feeds into that. And I mean, I'm a city girl at heart. I'm not a camper, like that, but there's something that happens out there when you're in the desert.
Right. Yeah, and I'm an East Coast person, so it's not something I can't wrap my head around it. So I'm just curious. But Steve, you were
the only time I was ever in the desert was that
really? First and last.
Yeah.
You were saying something about Kirkwood talking about, there was a great quote I think you were about to.
I was trying, yeah, I'm sorry about my connection here. Yeah, Chris said something about being in the desert and playing music to the audience, that everyone was ultra receptive to the music and the vibrations. And I'm sure that has a little bit to do with the acid mentality, but I enjoyed what he had to say about that there was a heightened awareness because you're not in a club, you're not dealing with the usual things that you deal with in a club, and it was a unique circumstance. I wish I could have seen that.
Yeah, you don't have the usual set of distractions you have at a club. You don't have the bar. You don't have the...
Exactly.
So it's really you and, someone in the film, and I apologize for not remembering the name, but they described it, the whole experience between getting in the bus, going out, hearing the music, and coming home as magical. And, I think maybe that's not too strong of a word. I mean, I could only imagine it had to have been.
Yeah, it's just that it is an alien landscape, and so it's like you're just going on a bus or in a car, but you're being transported to this other place. And I think the way, certainly that's true of Burning Man. I mean, Coachella, I don't know, like you're still you're in a polo field or whatever, but I still think there's something about just the light being different. And so it's like it's a very kind of safe version of maybe what we were doing, but there's still those elements to it. And there's a whole interesting story, which I wasn't able to put into the film, but starting with the original desert rock people, Queens of the Stone Age and Caius, and a friend of ours, Mario Lally, who was one of the first people to do those shows. And those guys, they were hardcore bands that once they started playing with a generator out in the desert, the music started to change because they would play all night, and it got to be much more like Black Sabbath, heavy rock kind of thing. But Golden Voice was kind of around all that too, and putting on certain shows. So leading up to Coachella, there were some kind of misfired desert things that I think we're going to tell the story on our DVD as an extra, because Mario does it really well. Like by the end, somebody's been knifed and the highway patrol's there, and then he's the only guy left cleaning up this mess. And then the local news from Palm Springs shows up, and they're like, so what happened here?
Right.
But anyway, so there's just, I think there's an element of just, it lends itself to sort of this outlaw feeling of like, you're outside of society's control also. And in our case, it always worked out well. I think it was such a pressurized situation in clubs and stuff that getting the same people, but in a totally different setting, made it feel very different. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it probably goes back, well, at that point, again, you were under this microscope when you're in LA, and you get out there, and I can only imagine how, especially back then, because again, looking the way kids did then, it was, you can look that way now, and it wouldn't. I'm not sure what it takes right now to really make anyone look twice, but certainly back then. So if you get all these people out into the middle of the desert, it must have felt like safe, like, you know, this is like a safe place.
Until Mark,
I really
up something.
Right. That's true.
If that flying plate would have taken off a few heads, we wouldn't be sitting here right now.
I certainly wouldn't. Yeah.
Before.
But I do think there's something powerful about I'm just going to say that, you know, since we've been talking about everybody being on acid and all that stuff, there were a lot of people that now are coming out of the woodwork saying, well, I wasn't tripping then. I had to drive and whatever, but they just also had a really powerful experience. And so I think that there, you know, there's different ways to approach it, for sure.
Well, again, it goes back to the communal thing, and you know, and I think that had to be a pretty powerful experience for anyone that was there. I want to mention also, by the way, anyone that's watching on YouTube right now, if you have questions, feel free to post them on YouTube, and we'll try and answer them the best we can. So, you know, I did a film about, I've done 2 films about the past, and one was about the DC punk scene in the 80s, and another was about a magazine called Cream and its heyday in the 70s. And the one question that people always ask, and I'm going to ask you all, because I just never know how to answer it. I mean, I think I know the answer, but what happened with Desolation Center was a time and a place. I mean, a lot of what happened in the 80s was of a time and a place, and but I'm always asked, like, can that happen again? Could that happen in 2020? And I'm just curious what the panel thinks of that, given where we're at right now, like what Steve alluded to with the co-opting and everything else. I mean, in the corporate clause that always seem to, you know, find their way into these types of events. Is something like this? I don't know. I'm just going to throw it out there. Could it happen again? And if so, how and why and all that kind of stuff.
Well, Stuart mentioned I still go out to this one group. One of the reasons they're still going on is that's why I can't tell you the name, but they're on the 27th anniversary, and I think it's a lot about vetting. You invite someone. They have their own manifesto. It's not intense, but it's simple. It's like invite someone you would invite into your home, and they're not in it for the money. All the money goes to the hard costs. It's a $10 donation at the door still, and it's very pared down to kind of like Desolation Center was. It's all about the music.
So it's music. Is it music and art? Is it?
It's pretty much just music.
And it's in the desert. Oh, that's incredible. So there. What do you guys think, Bob and Steve? Do you think something like this could ever? I mean, this stuff exists. You know, I'm not talking about concerts in the desert, but you know, obviously, there's always going to be these subcultures and these little things that are happening, these hot spots everywhere. But what do you think? Do you think something like this could take place maybe in other places?
She just proved me wrong, but I was going to say no. It can't happen, you know, because you know, well, especially in 2020, no one can even leave their house. But yeah, I don't see that happening, and I don't see. I mean, maybe it can. Like, maybe I'm just like, from a different generation, because I don't even know what bands kids would go see these days anywhere, for the most part. And so yeah, I mean, New York City will definitely never be like it was in the 70s or 80s.
Well, they do take place in the desert, so we have that. We can we'll go off on private land, you know, so don't need
God bless you. That's great.
The spirit is still there. You're keeping it alive. Stuart, are you involved in those at all, or?
You know, no, no. I mean, it's more like of a DJ culture thing, which I appreciate, but I haven't been motivated to go out there and do it. But I think that when I think about all the different things, evolutions that Bob's been through, you know, when you say, could it happen again? I think it's always going to happen differently. You know what I mean? Hopefully it wouldn't be the same. And I do think that, you know, one of the things about the LA punk scene, I think about somebody like Mike Watt, you know, that's in the film, is that we were kind of like in the shadow of stadium rock. You know, there was the Eagles and all, it was bigger, you know. And so we were just like a few people. And honestly, when I started going to gigs, I was 16. So, you know, kids that learned this idea. You could have a great time at a Chinese restaurant and see the Germs, you know, or whatever. So it could be small and cool. And so I think that's kind of the important thing. But as to whether I would do something exactly the same way, no, I definitely wouldn't. But I do like the idea of, now that we're finished with the film and we're screening, of doing other kinds of events and putting things together that, you know, maybe would have elements of it. And one might be in the desert. We might actually do Desolation Center at a drive-in, because that's, you know, socially distant, and we'll have music as part of it and stuff. So I think that, you know, there's possibilities of sort of rethinking where you present music, and it really does make a big difference.
So let's go back to the beginning, because Steve, Shelley, so you're working on the soundtrack with Stuart. Maybe, you know, it would be great, I'm just throwing it out there, you guys could perform the soundtrack live in the desert.
Brilliant. We'll work on it. I think it'll be hard enough to get all the approval we need to get the double album that we're trying to assemble.
Okay, ambitious. Okay, all right.
But yeah, we're hoping to represent everyone who's you know, who's in the movie, and it's quite a community of groups. You know.
I can imagine. How long did it take to Stuart, to put this whole thing together? We were talking about music. I know just the whole music component to any film takes a while. I mean, look, I'm sure you were still in touch with a lot of these folks, and I'm sure you were able to sort of ask for some favors and things like that. But how long did the whole film take? The whole production, everything from?
I mean, I guess we probably started about 5 years ago now. And I think, you know, the beginning of it was me getting back in touch with Mariska and saying, hey, do you still have those pictures of the desert shows that you took? And then, you know, as far as music clearance goes, I mean, people like Steve, I mean, it's been amazing because you've been through it twice, but to have that kind of, you know, level of support, you know, there's no way we could have done it without everybody helping us, you know, with music rights and all that. But I'm just lucky that the video is out there, you know, and I'm lucky that people recorded the audio, that, you know, one guy on a Sony Walkman, you know, something else from Flipside magazines, you know, VHS recorders, you know, and so it was kind of like a process of putting all these different things together. So it feels like, oh yeah, this is cool. But really what it is kind of like a big digital mashup of all these little elements.
Was there one nugget or one piece of found footage or maybe audio where you just went, it was like finding sunken treasure, you know, where you went, oh my God, this is...
One, I can think of two, and they're both from the night that Bob was out there at Gila Monster Jamboree. One of them was when Carmel, who was Red Cross's manager at that time, comes up to the microphone after they get there, after they've been lost for like 3 hours in the desert, and says, and Meat Puppets are still playing, and she's like, can the girl that drove us out to the desert come up, because my acid is in your car, it's an emergency. And you can hear the Meat Puppets like doing this incredible Space Jam under it. So that was like one of those like, wow, somebody should sample that, and like, you know. And then the other thing also, when a friend of ours, Dave Travis, he had assembled a lot of the different footage from Gila Monster Jamboree, and he's like, we have the We're in the Desert guy. I was like, no way. And because there was the guy who I think also whipped his dick out at one point, but he stumbles across the screen with like a vodka bottle, and he kind of commandeered the mic for a while and just was basically yelling like, we're in the desert. And And there are certain people that if you say, you know, Gila Muscle Jamboree, that's what their response will be, you know, to this day. And so to actually have that footage, and that just kind of blew me away, because I wasn't even sure. I mean, I remember having to take the microphone away from him and being like, this isn't going to be fun. But I mean, he was kind of cool. He finally did. But to see it again, that was just like, that brought me back. And that's what I thought was really cool, is that somebody had saved that footage, and it wasn't, you know, the headlining bands performing or anything. It was just kind of these other things that were going on, which I think gave it a lot of character.
Right. So we have a few questions here that I'm going to throw out. The first one is directed at Steve and Bob. The question is, have you guys ever drummed together on a Sonic Youth stage or anywhere else?
We have. One time at Folk City, Steve was on stage playing with Sonic Youth, and I was in one corner playing the drums, and Teresa and King Coffee from the Butthole Surfers were in another corner, and they were showing Richard Kern's films over the Sonic Youth while they were playing. That's the one night I remember.
That's true. That was one of my first shows with the band, maybe second or third. And also Bob, although we didn't play a concert, we both drummed maybe at Peppermint Lounge for the Death Valley 69 video.
Right.
So we have played together a little bit.
Okay. Folks want to know, and of course we were going to talk about this, and I'll bring it up again, but somebody wants to know if this film's going to be on Netflix, and it's not only on Netflix, it's streaming now, correct?
Well, it's definitely not on Netflix.
Sorry, it's not on
Full
Netflix.
disclosure. Yeah, no, I mean, you know, there's a lot of ways to see it streaming, just as of about the less than 2 weeks. So you can see it on iTunes or Amazon, Fandango now, Vimeo. And if you want to support, you know, there's ways to go to like the WFMU website or Amoeba Records, and you can stream it that way, and that helps independent music out as well. So, but yeah, you know, the reality of Netflix is that they're moving away from independent film and more toward their big shows, and so it's not like they're rushing to get something from Slam Dance Festival or whatever.
Yeah, that's a tough nut to crack, and that's a whole other episode we'll have to do here sometime. But yeah, so no to Netflix, but yes to iTunes, Apple, Amazon, Fandango now, Google Play, and Vimeo on demand. And one last question, I think it was part of that same question, is are you going to be doing additional drive-in theater screenings? That's what a lot of people are doing right now, and I don't know for how much longer. I guess until you know, it's this kind of little window of like, you know, what are we going to do? How do we get our film out there?
You know, it's funny. Like, I mean, I don't even. I'm hoping that we do one, because that would be really, really cool. And something that I actually talked to Kim and Thurston about. I don't know if Bob was part of that conversation too. That wouldn't it be cool to have Sonic Youth play in a drive-in? And you know, because after we did the Desert Show, like, what would we do next? You know, and so the idea has been there for a really long time. And so I think, yeah, maybe we could take it on the road, or, you know, I mean, it really depends on finding the drive-in that wants Desolation Center and is cool with live music that's really noisy and that kind of thing.
Well, again, it seems like the perfect film to be shown outdoors, considering so much of the film, which, by the way, is beautifully shot. You know, the desert scenes, especially that were shot recently, you know, beautifully shot stuff.
Yeah, I have to credit, you know, both Senator Valde and Jeremy, who Jeremy actually knew how to work a drone, which was like, so we rented one for a very small budget, and he was able to actually make all that stuff work. And yeah, it's a strange world out there where you can get that kind of beautiful footage that used to be helicopter shots, you know, with $100 drone rental.
Yeah, you get a sense of the expanse of the whole thing. But But I can't stress enough what a phenomenal film this is. I've watched it now maybe a half a dozen times. My wife is already tired of me repeating the lines from the film because I know it very well. But I encourage everyone to go check this out. Again, Desolation Center, streaming now on once again iTunes, Apple, Amazon, Fandango Now, Google Play, and Vimeo on demand. So I really appreciate. Unless anyone else has any questions or anything.
I have a question. When's the DVD coming out?
Well, the DVD is going to come out, and we have to edit all these extras and really make it. I want it to be kind of a cool package that will last. So I don't know. I'd say we're at least 6 months away from putting it out. But
cool.
And what's going on with the Cream doc, Scott?
No,
I was lucky enough to see it in Detroit, but
no, this is your show. We'll talk about that, but I appreciate you asking. Yeah, we will. We can talk about that, but in the meantime, go check out Desolation Center. And did you guys want to add anything else? Was there anything else we wanted to plug, or?
I was just going to say that if people want to keep up on what's going on with either maybe there'll be screenings someday again, or the DVD and things like that we've been talking about, just go to desolationcenter.com, and if they sign up for our email list, they'll be the first to know. And so that's one thing. And then also I just want to thank you guys. It's been really, really cool to have two members of Sonic Youth, and I love your films and Mariska. So anyway, honored, and thanks for doing this.
Thanks for your time. I enjoyed this thoroughly, and thanks. It was nice to meet Bob and Steve and Mariska. We've met before, but I just can't stress enough what a great film it is. And thank you for putting it out and for making this available to guys like me and to the rest of the world who are going to discover this whole. I think it's just going to blow people's minds. It's just beautifully done. So
I'm all for it. Blowing minds.
Right. Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Good night.